Okay, so to solve this, step one is to get one side equal to 0. In this case, it doesn't matter which side I get equal to 0. If I get the left side equal to 0, I would subtract 4w squared. But I don't actually want to do that because we usually want our first term to end up being positive. So instead of subtracting the 4w squared, I'm going to get the right side equal to 0 by adding 10w. So I'm going to add 10w to both sides, and that'll give me a 0 on the right side. All right, so then I'm going to have 4w squared plus 10w equals 0. Okay, we can still factor this, but it looks a little different. Notice it's not a trinomial like the two previous examples. There's only 2 terms, but it's not one of our special rules either. But there is an easy way to factor this. You might notice that these have a GCF. So 4w squared and 10w, those have a 2w in common. So to factor out the GCF, I'm going to divide by the 2w. When you factor out a GCF, don't forget to put it in the front. So I have the 2w in the front. And then inside, that would leave me with 2w 5. Okay, and then it's still equal to 0. So that's what we have so far. 2w times 2w plus 5 equals 0. So that's all we can do to factor, was just a GCF. Now, step 3, we still have to set each factor equal to 0 and solve. So like before, I do set all the factors equal to 0. So I have 2w equals 0 and 2w plus 5 equals 0. Okay. Now notice on this one, there is a w. So I can solve and isolate the w. So unlike the previous problem where we had the 2 with no w, this one has 2 with the w. So if I'm trying to get the w by itself, I would, it's 2 times w. So the inverse operation is divide. So I got to divide both sides by 2. So the 2 divides out and we're just left with w. On this side, 0 divided by 2 is just 0. So w equals 0 is one of our answers. For the other answer, I got to solve this equation. 2w plus 5 equals 0. So to solve that, I'm going to subtract 5. So I would have 2w equals negative 5. And to get rid of that 2, I would divide by 2. So we get w equals negative 5 halves, negative 5 over 2. So as you notice so far, all of these have been able to factor in slightly different ways, and all of them have had 2 solutions. Most quadratic equations have 2 solutions, although you could have ones with 1 solution as well. But usually they have 2. All right, so one more example. This is our last one in the notes for now, and then we'll do practice problems. So write down the last example, number 5. We have 5p squared equals 4 plus p. All right, 5p squared equals 4 plus p. Hi, buddy. Okay, so to solve this, I have to get one of the sides equal to 0. Technically, it'd be easier to get the left side equal to 0 by subtracting 5p squared. However, I'm not going to do that. I don't like to factor when there's a negative as the leading coefficient. So instead, I'm still going to get the right side equal to 0, even though there's 2 terms. So to get the right side equal to 0, I have to subtract a 4. and I have to subtract a p. So of course, since it's an equation, whatever I do on one side, I have to do on the other. So I have to subtract 4 and subtract p from that side as well. Okay, so the right side now is equal to 0. Now, one thing I want to point out on the left side, when you write it down, none of these can combine because they're not like terms. But when we write it down, you do want to make sure you write it in order so that it's like this form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So if I write it in order, it's going to be 5p squared minus p minus 4 equals 0. So pay attention to that to help us with the factoring. Okay, so that's step 1, get one side equal to 0. Step 2, we want to factor. Now, this one, I again notice it has a leading coefficient, but this time there is not a common factor. So we have to go through the grouping process to factor this. I got to rewrite the middle term and use grouping. And remember, you can use the x to help you find the right numbers. I have to multiply the 5 times the -4. So I'm looking for numbers that multiply to be -20, and they add up to a -1. That's the number in the middle. So those two numbers that I can use are that multiply to -20 and add up to -1 are 4 and 5. I'm going to need a -5 and a +4. Okay, so with those two numbers, don't forget you got to rewrite your middle term. So I keep the 5p squared as the first term. I'm rewriting the middle term with a -5p and a +4p. And then I keep the -4 as my last term. Now that there are 4 terms, now we can factor by grouping. Okay, so that's what we did on one of the practice problems at the beginning of class. So let's do the grouping. So remember, with grouping, we group each 2 together, first 2 and second 2, and look for a GCF of each group. The first group, 5p squared minus 5p, the GCF is 5p. And when you factor out the GCF, make sure you put it in the front. So we have 5p in the front. And then this would divide to give me p minus, right here, be careful because we have 5p divided by 5p, which is 1. So it's not 0. It actually gives us p minus 1 in the parentheses. All right, second group, 4p minus 4. The GCF is 4. So I put the 4 on the outside, and then this would divide to give me p minus 1. Now you'll notice again, there is another GCF. They have now each group has a p minus 1 in common. So now factor out the p minus 1. And when you do that, it goes in the front. So p minus 1 is one of our factors. The other factor that would be inside the parentheses would be what's left. If I divide out the p minus 1, I'm left with a 5p from the first group. And if I divide out the p minus 1s from the second group, I'm left with a +4. Okay, so those are my factors. P minus 1, 5p plus 4. And don't forget, it's still equal to 0. All right, so that was all part of step 2, factoring. That's why we want to be pretty good at factoring, because it's just one step of this process. All right, the third step after we factor is to actually solve. So don't forget to solve. Now we have to set each factor equal to 0 and solve each equation. So my first factor is p minus 1. So I have p minus 1 equals 0. And then I have 5p plus 4 equals 0. All right, and then I am going to solve each of those. Now both of these are linear equations because there's just p to the first power. And so to solve, I just have to isolate the p. So on this equation, p minus 1 equals 0. To get the p by itself, I need to add 1. We get p equals 1. That's one of our solutions. For this one, 5p plus 4 equals 0. I need to subtract 4 first. So we get 5p equals -4. And then divide by 5 to get the p by itself. And so on this one, we get p equals -4/5. Okay, so just like the other problems, this one ends up having two solutions. P equals 1 and p equals -4/5. So all these examples we factored in a slightly different way. So we do need to know how to factor different types of expressions. And then once we factor, don't forget to solve to get the two answers. All right, so we're gonna stop there in the notes for right now. We'll see how the practice goes to see if we have time for more notes in a little bit or not. All right, so now we're gonna do some practice problems. So you can do the practice problems on whatever paper you would like. Real quick before we start the practice problem, I love seeing so many cameras on, but not everyone's are on. If your cameras are off, let me see your pretty face. Hopefully your cameras work by now. If they don't, make sure you let me know that you're here, even if I can't see you. All right. Okay, so we're gonna do a couple practice problems. If I don't see you, I'll be checking with you to make sure you're answering. All right, so our first practice problem should be pretty easy, hopefully. Let me pull up my page. Okay, so here is the first practice problem. Solve x squared plus 14x plus 33 equals 0. So this one's similar to problem number 1. It should, hopefully, it's already equal to 0. So that makes it easier. And it should be easy to factor because the leading coefficient is 1. But then after you factor, don't forget to solve. And then once you have your two solutions, type them to me in the chat. Good, seeing lots of good answers. All right, let's take a like maybe 30, 40 more seconds. All right, I think I got most of your answers. So this hopefully, so the two solutions, you can write them as x equals -11 and x equals -3. You can also just type the numbers like -11, -3. Just make sure you write them as solutions and don't leave them as factors. So just real quick, if we were factoring this, the numbers that we're looking for multiply to be 33 and add up to 14. So when I factor this into two binomials, the numbers would be 11 and 3. So these would be my factors, x plus 11 and x plus 3. So the factors look like that. Now to actually solve, don't forget to set each factor equal to 0 and solve each one. If you do that step in your head, that's fine. Just make sure you don't forget to do it. On this one, x plus 11 equals 0, we would subtract 11. So we get x equals -11 as one of our answers. And then on this one, subtract 3, and we get x equals -3. So those are our answers there. Okay, we're gonna do another one. So this one is a very basic type because it should have been hopefully very easy to factor. The next one, here's our next example. I want you to solve 2x squared minus 7x equals 30. So a couple of things to watch out for on this is you do have to make one side equal to 0 first. So make sure you do that first. And then when you're trying to factor, this one has the leading coefficient. So this is like example 4 on the notes. You're going to have to rewrite the middle term and use grouping. All right, so take a couple minutes and try this problem. 2x squared minus 7x equals 30. All right. I'm gonna give it a couple more minutes. Or like, we'll say like 45 more seconds or so. Good, I'm seeing a lot of good answers. I'm also, remember to type a question mark if you don't know how to do the problem so that I at least know you're there and participating. Especially if I didn't see you on camera. All right. Okay, so I am seeing actually a lot of good answers. I do just want to make sure we go over this just to make sure we got it down. The answers, again, be careful with your signs. I did see some, I don't know if it's just because you forgot to type the negative, but the answer should be -5/2 and 6. X equals -5/2 and 6. Okay, so a lot of you got that, but I did have some question marks. So we are going to go over this. The first thing, as I mentioned, it's not equal to 0. So we are going to get one side equal to 0 first. So to do that, I would subtract 30. And it's an equation, so I do that to both sides. Because then on the right side, that'll give me a 0. On the left side, since none of those combine, I'd have 2x squared minus 7x minus 30 equals 0. Now I have to factor this, but you got to be careful of the fact that there is a leading coefficient. So I'm looking for numbers, I have to multiply those together, 2 times -30. I'm looking for numbers that multiply to be -60 and add up to the middle term. So they're going to add up to -7. So the two numbers that work, the two numbers we can find that multiply to be -60 and add up to -7 would be a -12 and a +5. Oops, wrote the wrong thing. -12, +5. Those multiply to be -60, add up to -7. So remember, we have to use those to rewrite this middle term. So I'm going to keep the 2x squared as my first term. I'm going to rewrite -7x as -12x plus 5x. And then I'm going to keep the -30. Then, because there's 4 terms, now I can factor this by grouping. So group the first 2 together and group the second 2 together and look for a GCF of each group. So the first group has a GCF of 2x. So I'm going to divide out the 2x and put it in the front. And then inside the parentheses, that would leave us with x minus 6. Okay. From the second group, 5x minus 30, that has a 5 in common. So I'm going to factor out a GCF of 5. And when I divide out a 5, I'd be left with x minus 6. Again, we should have a GCF now for each group. Each group has an x minus 6 in common. So take out the x minus 6. And then when I divide out the x minus 6, from this group, I would be left with 2x. And from this group, I would be left with plus 5. Okay, so these would be my factors, x minus 6 and 2x plus 5. but we are not done yet until we actually solve. So then to solve, we have to set each factor equal to 0. Right, so I would set the x minus 6 equal to 0. And I would set the 2x plus 5 equal to 0. Okay, so set each factor equal to 0 and then solve. So add 6 to both sides on this one, and so that's where we get x equals 6. And then on this one, subtract 5. So we have 2x equals negative 5. And then divide by 2 to get x equals negative 5 over 2. Okay, there's where our two answers come from. So remember, we did all this factoring in section R2. We spent probably at least a week on factoring. So if you're still struggling with factoring, you can always go back to Google Classroom and rewatch the R2 videos just to kind of help you refresh your memory on factoring. But hopefully the factoring that we did in class was enough to refresh your memory. I don't know what I just did. There we go. Okay. So, whoops, that's not what I meant to do.